Western Front, January 1917. The winter that year wasn't just cold, it was murderous. Temperatures plunged to single digits, transforming trenches into frozen graves where frostbite killed as efficiently as enemy fire. In a dugout near Arras, France, a mechanic named Corporal James Whitmore watched his fellow soldiers huddle around regulation field stoves that burned through coal like water through a sieve, producing more smoke than heat. His comrades called him obsessive. Officers called him reckless. But Whitmore had noticed something the military engineers overlooked. Heat wasn't escaping because it was being lost. It was never being captured in the first place. What did this mechanic understand about thermal retention that the War Department's best engineers had missed? And why would his primitive modification to a standard trench stove prove more effective than designs that had cost the Army thousands of pounds to develop? If you're fascinated by wartime ingenuity and survival engineering, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story gets even more incredible. Eastern France, winter 1916 to 1917. Trench warfare had devolved into a war of attrition, but the real enemy wasn't always German artillery. It was the cold. Night temperatures regularly dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius, and the standard-issue British field stoves, designed for efficiency and portability, failed catastrophically in prolonged sub-zero conditions. Corporal James Whitmore, a former railway mechanic from Sheffield, had spent 3 months observing the same pattern. Soldiers would burn through 12 to 15 pounds of coal per night, yet by 3 a.m., the dugouts were freezing again. The regulation stoves, compact cast-iron boxes with short chimneys, radiated heat briefly, then cooled rapidly. Worse, poor ventilation meant dangerous smoke accumulation, forcing men to choose between suffocation and exposure. Whitmore proposed something his platoon found laughable: burying a modified fuel drum at an angle, wrapping it with sandbags, and extending the chimney pipe through a serpentine path before it exited the dugout. "You'll cook us alive or fill this hole with carbon monoxide," Sergeant Davies warned him. Another soldier called it a coal mine waiting to collapse. The consensus was clear. It was the foolish tinkering of a mechanic who didn't understand battlefield realities. But Whitmore understood something they didn't. Cast iron loses heat quickly through radiation, especially when exposed to freezing air currents in poorly sealed trenches. His design wasn't about burning hotter. It was about trapping heat longer. He'd noticed that dugouts with deeper floors stayed warmer, and that metal objects buried in earth retained warmth for hours after a fire died. The principle was simple: thermal mass. If he could surround a heat source with dense, insulating material, the stored warmth would radiate slowly throughout the night. He scavenged a 40-gallon oil drum, cut ventilation slots near the base, and angled the entire structure 30 degrees into the earth. Then came the critical modification. Instead of a straight vertical chimney, he bent the exhaust pipe into 390-degree turns, each section buried under 6 inches of packed clay and sand. The bends would slow the exhaust gases, forcing them to surrender their heat to the surrounding earth before escaping into the frozen air above. "That chimney will clog with creosote in 2 days," an engineer from the Royal Engineers told him flatly. "And if it doesn't, the draft will be so weak you'll smoke yourself out before morning." The man had studied thermodynamics at Cambridge. Whitmore had learned heat transfer by fixing boiler systems in Leeds. The engineer walked away shaking his head. Still, Whitmore pressed on. He sealed every joint with a mixture of clay, ash, and water, creating an airtight barrier. He insulated the drum's exterior with sandbags filled with dry sand and gravel, materials that absorbed and held heat far better than air. Finally, he installed a makeshift damper, a sliding metal plate that could regulate airflow, controlling combustion speed without extinguishing the fire entirely. When he finished, the structure looked absurd. A lopsided metal tumor half buried in the trench floor, with a chimney that zigzagged like a drunk snake before vanishing into the earthen wall. His squad mates nicknamed it Whitmore's coffin warmer. One joked it would be his tombstone when it exploded. But Whitmore didn't need their approval. He needed one coal night to prove them wrong. Let's break down exactly what Whitmore built. and why every modification mattered. The core of the system was a 40-gallon steel oil drum, approximately 35 inches tall and 18 inches in diameter. Unlike the shallow, wide regulation stoves, this vertical cylinder maximized the surface area exposed to the combustion chamber while minimizing the rate of heat loss through the top opening. Whitmore cut 3 evenly spaced rectangular vents, each 4 inches wide and 6 inches tall, near the base of the drum. These openings allowed cold air to enter from below, feeding the fire with oxygen while creating a natural convection current. Cold air in, hot exhaust out. The drum was buried at a 30-degree angle, with its base positioned 18 inches below the dugout floor and its top opening level with the ground. This wasn't arbitrary. By sinking the heat source into the earth, Whitmore surrounded it with thermal mass, dense soil that would absorb radiant heat and re-emit it slowly over hours. The earth acted as a heat battery, storing energy during active combustion and releasing it gradually after the fire died down. But the real genius was the chimney system. Standard trench stoves used a simple vertical pipe, 6 to 8 feet of straight metal tubing that vented smoke directly upward. Efficient for draft, yes, but catastrophic for heat retention. Hot exhaust gases, carrying most of the fire's energy, shot straight into the freezing night air. Whitmore's design forced those gases to travel through 14 feet of pipe bent into 3 right-angle turns, each section buried under 6 inches of packed clay, sand, and gravel. Every bend in the pipe slowed the exhaust flow, increasing the contact time between hot gases and the surrounding earth. As the smoke cooled, it transferred thermal energy to the soil, which radiated that warmth back into the dugout. By the time the exhaust exited the trench, it was barely warmer than the ambient air, a sign that the system had extracted nearly every available BTU from the combustion process. To prevent creosote buildup, the oily residue that clogs chimneys, Whitmore angled the first pipe section at 45 degrees rather than 90, allowing gravity to drain condensation back toward the firebox where it would re-vaporize. He also installed a clean-out port at the base of the first bend, sealed with a removable clay plug, so he could clear blockages without dismantling the entire system. The final critical component was the damper, a sliding steel plate positioned just above the fire chamber, controlled by a wire that ran to the dugout's entrance. By adjusting the damper, Whitmore could regulate airflow, choking the fire to a slow smolder that burned just 2 pounds of coal per hour, or opening it fully for rapid heating when soldiers first entered the shelter. This level of control was unheard of in standard field stoves, which operated at a single, inefficient burn rate. The insulation layer, sandbags packed with dry sand and gravel, served a dual purpose. First, it prevented heat from radiating outward into the trench walls, directing thermal energy upward into the living space instead. Second, it protected the metal drum from rapid cooling caused by wind and precipitation. Even during sleet storms, the sand barrier maintained a stable temperature gradient, keeping the stove's exterior warm enough to prevent condensation and rust. When a Royal Engineers captain inspected the design, he was skeptical. "You've created a thermal maze," he said, tapping the buried chimney with his boot. "Complex systems fail in the field. What happens when this clogs? When the clay cracks? When groundwater seeps in?" He was right to ask. Battlefield conditions destroyed delicate equipment daily. But Whitmore had designed for durability, not elegance. Every component was reparable with materials scavenged from any trench: scrap metal, sandbags, clay from the walls. "It's not a laboratory experiment, sir," Whitmore replied quietly. "It's survival engineering." The captain didn't argue further, but he didn't approve the design for wider use either. In his report, he noted, "Corporal Whitmore's modifications demonstrate creative thinking but lack empirical validation under combat conditions. Recommend observation before replication." Translation: let him freeze if it doesn't work. Whitmore didn't need permission. He needed one night cold enough to prove the physics. Like this video if you're learning something new about wartime survival engineering. And stick around because the real test is coming. January 14th, 1917. The temperature began dropping at sunset, first to 15 degrees Fahrenheit minus 9 degrees Celsius, then 8 degrees Fahrenheit minus 13 degrees Celsius, then lower. By 10 p.m., the official reading at the battalion command post was minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit minus 19 degrees Celsius, with wind gusts pushing the effective temperature far below zero. In the exposed trenches, sentries rotated every 20 minutes to prevent frostbite. Inside the dugouts, soldiers burned coal frantically, trying to keep the interior temperature above freezing. Whitmore's dugout housed 8 men, including Sergeant Davies, who had openly called the modified stove a death trap. At 7 p.m., Whitmore loaded the firebox with 6 pounds of coal and a handful of kindling soaked in lamp oil. He adjusted the damper to half open, allowing a strong initial draw, and struck a match. Within minutes, the fire caught. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Smoke trickled from the buried chimney's exit vent, a faint gray plume that dissipated quickly in the wind. The metal drum radiated warmth, but no more than a standard stove. Davies watched with arms crossed. "Give it an hour," he muttered. "Then we'll see if we're warm or poisoned." But as the fire settled into a steady burn, something remarkable happened. The dugout's interior temperature, measured with a field thermometer hung near the back wall, began to rise, not rapidly, but steadily. By 9 p.m., it had climbed to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius. By 11 p.m., it reached 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. Outside, the mercury had fallen to minus 8 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 22 degrees Celsius. In the adjacent dugout, soldiers using a regulation stove had burned through 14 pounds of coal by midnight and were still shivering. Their interior temperature hovered around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius, technically above freezing, but cold enough that condensation from their breath formed ice on the corrugated metal ceiling. Every hour, they had to shovel in more coal, producing thick smoke that forced them to crack the entrance tarp, letting in frigid air that negated any heat gain. Whitmore's stove, by contrast, consumed only 3 pounds of coal between 9 p.m. and midnight, and the temperature continued to rise. By 1 a.m., the thermometer read 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius. The men had removed their overcoats. The earthen walls, warmed by radiant heat from the buried drum and heated soil, no longer felt damp. One soldier pressed his palm against the clay wall and jerked it back. It was warm to the touch, like sun-baked brick. "How is this possible?" Davies asked, staring at the thermometer. The wind outside howled, rattling the tarp over the dugout entrance, but inside, the air was still and comfortable. The chimney's exit vent emitted only a faint shimmer of heat. Most of the thermal energy had been absorbed by the earth and re-radiated into the living space. Whitmore explained as he adjusted the damper to minimum flow, reducing the fire to a slow smolder. "The heat isn't escaping, Sergeant. It's being stored. Every bend in that chimney, every inch of clay and sand around the drum, it's all holding warmth. Even if the fire dies now, this dugout will stay warm for another 4 hours." At 3 a.m., the fire had burned down to embers. Whitmore added just 2 pounds of coal, not to reignite a blaze, but to maintain the thermal mass. The interior temperature stabilized at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius. Outside, the official reading was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius. The difference, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. But the real proof came at dawn. When the men emerged from the dugout, they found soldiers in neighboring shelters huddled in blankets, their faces gray with exhaustion. Many hadn't slept. They'd spent the night feeding fires and shivering. Frostbite cases were reported in 3 dugouts. One man had to be evacuated with early-stage hypothermia. Whitmore's squad, by contrast, had slept soundly. Their dugout had consumed a total of 11 pounds of coal over 9 hours, compared to 25 to 30 pounds in standard shelters. The insulated stove had burned 60% less fuel while maintaining a temperature 40 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than regulation systems. Sergeant Davies, a man who rarely admitted error, stood outside Whitmore's dugout at sunrise, staring at the half-buried metal drum with something close to reverence. "I called you reckless," he said quietly. "I was wrong." Word spread fast. By midday, soldiers from neighboring platoons were inspecting the design, taking notes, sketching the chimney layout. An officer from the Royal Engineers arrived that afternoon, thermometer in hand, and conducted his own measurements. His report, filed 2 days later, was blunt. Corporal Whitmore's system demonstrates superior thermal efficiency under extreme conditions. Recommend immediate field replication and formal documentation. The test had proven what laboratory engineers refused to believe, that thermal mass, not combustion intensity, was the key to survival heating in trench warfare. And that sometimes the best engineering came not from textbooks, but from frozen mud and desperation. Within a week, 3 other dugouts in Whitmore's battalion had replicated the design. Within a month, modified stoves appeared in trenches across the Arras sector. The design spread informally, soldier to soldier, sketch to sketch, moving faster than any official directive could have managed. By March 1917, field engineers were documenting variations of Whitmore's system in at least 8 divisions along the Western Front. The modifications varied based on available materials. Some units used larger drums, increasing thermal mass. Others added a secondary heat chamber, a metal box positioned above the firebox where soldiers could heat rations or melt snow for drinking water without wasting precious coal. A few enterprising engineers installed horizontal pipes beneath the dugout floor, creating a crude radiant heating system that warmed the earth itself, preventing the ground from freezing solid. But the core principle remained unchanged. Slow the exhaust, capture the heat, store it in mass. What Whitmore had proven in one freezing night became doctrine for trench survival engineering. His design even influenced post-war heating systems. The serpentine chimney layout, once mocked as overcomplicated, became a standard feature in rural wood stoves throughout Britain and Europe in the 1920s and 30s. Modern rocket mass heaters, used today in off-grid homes and survival shelters, operate on the same physics Whitmore discovered in a frozen trench. Long, insulated exhaust paths that extract maximum energy from combustion gases. The British Army never officially credited Whitmore. His name appears in no engineering manuals, no victory reports. But his innovations saved lives, not through grand strategy or technological breakthrough, but through simple, replicable physics applied under extreme conditions. In total, an estimated 200 to 300 modified stoves were in use by the war's end, each one burning less fuel, producing less smoke, and keeping soldiers warmer than anything the War Department had designed. Sergeant Davies, writing in his personal diary in April 1917, noted, "Whitmore's stove has done more for morale than a month's leave. The lads sleep now. They wake warm. It's a small thing, but small things matter when you're living in a hole in the ground." Compare that achievement to modern military heating technology. Today's portable field heaters, diesel-fueled, electronically controlled, costing thousands of dollars per unit, achieve roughly the same result Whitmore managed with scrap metal, clay, and sandbags. The U.S. military's M67 tent heater, for example, produces approximately 75,000 BTUs per hour and can heat a 16 by 32 foot tent to 60 degrees Fahrenheit in sub-zero conditions. Impressive, certainly, but it requires liquid fuel, electrical ignition, and regular maintenance. Whitmore's stove required only coal, a match, and an understanding of thermodynamics. This isn't to romanticize primitive technology. Modern systems are safer, cleaner, and more reliable. But Whitmore's story illustrates a deeper truth about engineering under constraint. That innovation doesn't always come from laboratories and PhDs. Sometimes, it comes from a mechanic in a frozen trench who refuses to accept that freezing to death is inevitable. The lesson isn't just historical. It's practical. Today's survivalists, preppers, and off-grid enthusiasts build rocket stoves, thermal mass heaters, and buried heat exchange systems based on the same principles Whitmore applied. His design proves that effective heating doesn't require expensive equipment or complex technology, just an understanding of heat transfer, insulation, and thermal mass. In war, brilliance rarely comes from planning rooms. It's born in frozen mud, in desperation and necessity, by those who refuse to die quietly. Whitmore didn't invent a new physics. He simply understood the old physics better than the men who designed the regulation stoves. And in the end, that understanding was the difference between sleeping warm and freezing in the dark. If this story of wartime engineering and survival ingenuity inspired you, hit that like button, subscribe for more military history deep dives, and drop a comment below. What other forgotten innovation from the trenches should we cover next? Because history is full of stories like this. Unsung mechanics, dismissed ideas, and solutions that worked when expert designs failed.